These attacks that took place during our overnight in Mali, that's in West Africa, for those of you who don't know. It's part of the country that the northern half of it, northeastern half of it, happens to be in the Sahara Desert. And the southeastern half of it, or southwestern half of it, happens to be down into an area where it's much more lush with vegetation as you start moving into to Central Africa. Now you've got people right now saying we can't jump to conclusions about who would have stormed this hotel and taken hostages and started killing people. We can't. We simply can't do that because we don't have all the facts. Now, some years ago, when a guy tried to set off a bomb in Times Square in New York City, the first thing that happened at the news conference was Mayor Mike Bloomberg. He was then the mayor of that city, jumped up and said, "Well, we think it could have been an angry Tea Partier." And media ran with that, even though it happened to be an Islamic terrorist. But we're told we can't speculate. Well, let's see. Mali, Africa, right on the edge of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is filled with people of what religious faith? Oh, I see. Yes, but we can't jump to conclusions. We've got more on that. If we'll get updates this morning, apparently the government has stormed the hotel, so we may be having more details coming up through the morning. Stay tuned to the 9 o'clock news from Fox coming up in just a little under 40 minutes. Wanted to remind people, here we are now 6 days away from Thanksgiving. I went yesterday and did a little shopping in preparation, and I noticed that there's a lot of great food out there, but a lot of people still, they like to bring, one of the reasons a lot of people hunt, they enjoy the sport of it too, but a lot of people, at least when I was growing up, they did it because it helped feed their families through the winter. And you may be thinking about putting something that you brought home, that you bagged, on the table this year. High Desert Meat Processing processes one animal at a time, and what you bring in is exactly what you're going to get back. Darren Van Horn, the owner of High Desert Meat Processing in Twin Falls, Idaho, he has more than 30 years' experience doing this. Visit High Desert Meat Processing on Facebook and read reviews of other customers. You can give High Desert Meat Processing a call for all of your wild game and domestic processing needs. The number is 734-9949. High Desert Meat does in-house smoking. Nothing gets shipped out. They do specialty meats, jerky. You can get salami, summer sausage, kielbasa, brats, Polish dogs, and much, much more. USDA approved, and Darren works closely with local beef growers and their programs to ensure quality meat. The number 734-9949. Mr. Labrador was not the only person with a few pointed comments at this hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday about the refugee resettlement program. His associate, a fellow by the name of Trey Gowdy from South Carolina. Gowdy his community was also targeted as a resettlement place, his home city. They were going to resettle immigrants from war-torn Syria there, and he's been asking some questions about this for several months, long before many of his colleagues happen to be doing that. And he takes offense when the president says we're being mean and rude to widows and orphans.
What amount of risk is acceptable? If our experts are telling us this is not a risk-free endeavor, and few things in life are, but someone's going to need to tell me and the people I work for what amount of risk is acceptable when you're talking about national security and public safety. And I'll say this in conclusion. The president says we're scared of widows and orphans. With all due respect to him, what I'm really afraid of is a foreign policy that creates more widows and orphans. So where maybe he ought to start is a foreign policy in the Middle East, including Syria, where people can go back to their homelands, which is their preference, go back to their homelands. Maybe you ought to defeat that JV team that you thought you had contained. That would be the very best thing you could do to help people who aspire to a better life.
This morning I was reading Wesley Pruden, reading Wesley Pruden at the Washington Times. He's the former editor of that newspaper, retired, but now writes a biweekly column still. And Mr. Pruden was saying, you realize when this first got started, it was all about the attack and what we need to do to stand up to these people and how are we going to fight these people. And then the president of France said it's all out war, and Mr. Obama said, well, we still need to bring refugees in. So Obama suddenly shifted the argument. His enemies are Republicans who are opposed to that. You get the drift? He doesn't want to have to fight these people, so he immediately shifted the focus, and now the enemy is now Republicans instead of ISIS. You get how that works? And media went along with Mr. Obama after he made sure. You had a CNN reporter at the first news conference Mr. Obama held saying, when are you going to do something about these? And then he implied they didn't have parents who were married. Since then, though, the media has jumped on board the bandwagon and joined him in pounding on the mean Republicans instead of ISIS. And Eddie Scary, who's a good name, who's a writer over at the Washington Examiner, has several examples here from the New York Times, from newspapers in Los Angeles, from newspapers in Detroit, newspapers in Chicago, where they're all saying, oh, these terrible Republicans won't allow these widows and orphans to come here. But among those liberal columnists at the newspapers in this country, one of the big ones has broken ranks. Roger Cohen, a native of South Africa, he writes for the New York Times, and his column yesterday was entitled Body Bags in Paris. These killers make us hostages of our own democracies. They trample on the very border-crossing freedoms that European passports afford them. The West post-Iraq has lost its capacity for rage even at this. And he says that is dangerous. The French president, François Hollande, says France is at war against a jihadi army. Then Obama wavered. Hesitation has been Obama's MO on Syria. He says now there are body bags in Paris. And he goes on to say Stalin was an effective Western ally in World War II. Hitler was defeated, but the division of Europe ensued and the Soviet enslavement of half the continent. Maybe Putin can help ISIS or help against ISIS, but if the West is a mere spectator, the result will be equally disastrous, he says. America and its allies must be present on the ground as Russia if they are to shape the Syrian government following all of this. So his point being, you can't walk away from it any longer if you want to say in what it's going to look like afterward. And remember, Putin, as long as 3 years ago, approached Mr. Obama as well as the Prime Minister of England and said, let's put this old alliance back together and take care of this problem, and they blew him off. And this is the result of it. Now he's going to take care of the job on his own, and once he does, he's not likely to leave. 8:30, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Oh, there was a school teacher at a public school who actually wrote a song, an ode to Islam, and had her students sing it. Parents at the school system are now enraged. Can you imagine that? Just a few days after all of this took place in Paris, and here's this teacher saying, let's sing pleasantries about Islam. What kind of education are your children getting in this day and age? Details on that coming up. So some very bright school teacher at a middle school, I think it's California, where else would it be, decided to write a song praising Islam and have the students sing it. Daily Caller has this. The site of the singing was Springview Middle School in Huntington Beach. The teacher made up the verses and set the ditty to the rousing tune of Fight Song. So, I'm not a great singer, but I can give you some of the lyrics. Like a sandstorm in the desert sending camels into motion, like how a single faith can make a heart open, they might only have one God, but they can make an explosion. Yeah, we saw that last week. This is their fight song, Spread Islam Now song. And then it goes on to say, and they don't really care if no Jews have ceased believe, 'cause they still have a lot of others to reach. Islam Allah's on the way, they will preach them loud tonight. Can you hear their voices this time? Can you imagine your children having to sing that in their schools, especially when it disparages Jews, and I guess the C's would be Christians? What would your reaction be? Now, you can bet, of course, that the media in Los Angeles is saying, well, she's just teaching them to be multicultural and respect the faith of others. No, she's teaching them that it's the one and only faith. That's what's going on there. And these people are in our schools, and they're living amongst us, and they are having an influence on your children. 8:33, Bill Colley this morning with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. I started to write my own Islam song for school children. I'll get to that in just a moment, but first, I do want to remind you, hearing this show, if you don't get a chance to hear it, you're going to be missing a lot. So you want to make sure that your hearing is in great shape, and you can do that by making an appointment, getting a screening, a free screening with Dr. Christine Pickup, a doctor of audiology at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert. She's at 1218 9th Street, Unit Number 2 in Rupert, Idaho, 208-312-0957, and you can also contact her through the website, MountHarrisonAudiology.com. Are you on medication for high blood pressure or a diuretic? These medications can affect your hearing. Hearing health is a reflection of your overall health. When you come in for a free wellness hearing screening at Mount Harrison Audiology, Dr. Pickup will review your medications and also discuss ways to protect your hearing in the future. I decided to start writing I just ran out of time. I was trying to write quickly this morning while I was having my coffee at home, and doing a little show preparation during breakfast, so I thought I'd write my own Islam song for school children, and it goes like this. Oh, Islam is a friend of mine that will kill me anytime for a nickel or a dime or a bit of genocide. Ta-ra-ra, boom, D.A. There is no school today. We've all done passed away. And then I ran out of time. I had to get up and come to work. And I thought that might be a much more easier one for the students to sing, and they could maybe even dance to that, too. And it might be a lot more truthful than the one they're learning in Huntington Beach, California. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You can reach our program today by dialing 736-0300. That's 736-0300. Here we go. This is coming from Eric Erickson, the talk show host who sometimes fills in for Rush Limbaugh. He goes on to say, all of these folks on the left keep coming up with these Twitter hashtags. This is a bit like, how many people do you know who actually, when the attacks happened in France last week, they put up that French tricolor flag on their Facebook picture? It's a nice sentiment, true. And I guess it makes you feel better. But it doesn't stop what's going on. And it doesn't change our government's mind about perhaps bringing in terrorists here. And, and that number keeps coming up. That keeps cropping up. People saying, the argument, there's a writer today from the American Association of Evangelicals. I think that's what it's called. He's got a guest commentary today at the Washington Examiner explaining that, yes, he does believe it's a great vetting process. And the numbers clearly, he said, yeah, you might get a few bad apples in there. You might get a few bad apples, but gosh, overall, just look at this program and realize most of them aren't. Here you go again. It didn't take many bad apples to create such havoc and shut down a modern European country the other day. Did you hear Nigel Farage yesterday, the British politician, on Sean Hannity's program? If you didn't, this is Farage giving a speech in England about this situation a few days ago, and he said, when it comes to refugees and migrants, that we have to put on the brakes.
The mission, however,
that's not him. He sounds more like this.
The thing that I suppose that makes me angry about what happened in Paris is frankly the fact that it was so utterly and entirely predictable. I think we've reached a point where we have to admit to ourselves, in Britain and France and much of the rest of Europe, that mass immigration and multicultural division has, for now, been a failure.
Do you realize what would happen if a terrorist, for instance, took out the Perrine Bridge? What that would do to the economy here and how that would hamstring movement in southern Idaho? And again, you don't need an army to do it. Farage is saying the blame is squarely on political elites.
There is a problem, and we have to be honest about it. Our politicians, I'm afraid, haven't had the guts. We've known for years about the hate preachers saying things for which any of the rest of us would have been arrested on the spot. We know about the problems of the Trojan horses that we've seen in our schools and our prisons. And we have to also look, perhaps, at the population. There are now 3 million Muslim people living in Britain. That is an increase of 75% over the course of the last 10 years.
We keep hearing from the left in this country saying, well, we're only talking about a small handful of people. So what's the big deal? Well, I think in England it started with a small handful of people, didn't it? Now it's millions. That's what we're talking about. And he says there are many, many things to worry about.
That after the Charlie Hebdo attacks earlier this year in Paris, when polled, 27% of British Muslims expressed some sympathy with the motives that had carried out that massacre. 11% of that 3 million said they thought that the people who'd produced those cartoons of Muhammad actually deserved to be attacked. And amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds, there are about a third of young Muslims in Britain who've got very split and divided loyalties. In fact, it seems that a third think their loyalty to their religion or the interpretation of the religion they're told is greater than it is to this country.
So we are at a crossroad right now in the western part of the English-speaking world. That would be North America. We are at a crossroad, and that is, do we go down the same path that England and the rest of Europe went down? or do we say stop? Stand back for a moment and reconsider what we're getting ourselves into. We've got more coming up. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 32, haven't changed the temperature much in, the last couple of hours. It's 20 minutes away from 9 o'clock. We've got more on this subject coming up, as well as the decline of Obamacare.